Ms. Blackstock, for 10 minutes, please.
I'd first of all like to begin by recognizing that we're on unceded Algonquin territory and thanking you for the opportunity. You know, children may not always listen to their elders, the saying goes, but they never fail to imitate them. So the question is, what kind of example are we setting down domestically and internationally for the children of this generation about the way that we treat one another and about the way that we address and acknowledge discrimination both at an individual level and at a structural level? And here it requires a courageous conversation, because sometimes it's we, the good guys, who are doing the harm. And in this case, it is the Canadian government who continues to racially discriminate against First Nations children. And that has to be acknowledged, not only because it relates to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's top call to action about equity and child welfare to make sure that we raise this generation of children safely in their families, but also because it's simply the right thing to do. The other piece is, what have we learned from history? We apologize for residential schools, and then we apologize for the 60s scoop. And now Canada is out of compliance with 4 legal orders of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal to end racial discrimination with children. So what have we actually learned from residential schools? And what have we learned from the past, and how do we prepare this generation of children to learn from those past actions of racial discrimination affecting Indigenous peoples, but others as well, in ways that prepare them to address injustices in the contemporary format and going forward into the future? So today we saw in census figures that we're not holding up to our promise to the residential school survivors in terms of Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action number 1. Over 40% of all children under 4 are in child welfare care today are First Nations children. And keep in mind that when children were removed from residential schools, they were removed at the tender age of 5, and we saw the cataclysm that created. And these are preschoolers, which you, Chairperson, as a physician know that first 2,000 days of life lays down the fundamental building blocks of life. It's also a time important to this committee's mandate when children learn languages, particularly the Indigenous languages that are so at risk in this country in many cases. And that's why Canada's compliance with the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal orders is so essential. It's essential because it's about giving a generation of First Nations children a chance to grow up equitably and fairly in this country. But it's also about preparing a generation of non-Indigenous children so they never have to say they're sorry again. The contemporary tragedy is unfolding in front of us all. It's not behind us. It's not in the residential schools or the 60s scoop. There are more First Nations kids in care today than at any time in history. And we have an opportunity to do something about it by providing equitable and culturally based child welfare services to First Nations communities as the tribunal required, by ensuring the full and proper implementation of Jordan's Principle so that First Nations children can access all public services they need when they need them without additional red tape related to their First Nation status. And then the third thing that can be done is something I call the Spirit Bear Plan, which is for members of Parliament to ask the Parliamentary Budget Officer to cost out the aggregate value of all the inequitable services that First Nations children face. Keep in mind that First Nations children are not just receiving inequitable child welfare, they're receiving inequitable education, inequitable early childhood. Some of them can't get clean water, there's inadequate sanitation systems. We need to, as a country, see what that big figure looks like and then launch something akin to the Marshall Plan after Second World War to eradicate those inequalities in ways that take full consideration of children's development and children's best interests. If we can rebuild Europe in 10 years, we can certainly correct a fundamental racial injustice that's occurring in this country in far less time than that. And for those who say it's too expensive or too complicated, I ask you this. If we are so broke as a nation that the only way that we can fund things like arenas or subway systems is through racial discrimination against children, then what are the children losing to? And what does this country really stand for? I'm one taxpayer who is very happy to put off some of these projects that government spends as much as I would like them, if it means a child having a proper opportunity to grow up healthy and proud in this country for the first time in their culture's history in this country. Start off year 151 with a positive legacy. I'm going to move on to something else about learning from history. It's less well known, I guess, in our work, in that we are honored to collaborate with Beechwood Cemetery, which is Canada's national cemetery, Cairo's Project of Heart, with Truth and Reconciliation Commissioners Marie Wilson and Murray Sinclair, and with historian John Malloy and Ellen Gabriel. You see, what we have done is we recognize that in Canada's national cemetery are some of the most leading characters in a residential school story. Peter Henderson Bryce, the doctor who blew the whistle in 1907 on the preventable causes of death of children, who found that kids were dying at a rate of 25% a year for preventable causes, and knew that with additional $10,000 to $15,000 from the Canadian government, that many of those children's lives could be saved. He was the chief medical health officer of Canada. His findings published in papers. He's buried there. Duncan Campbell Scott, the leading bureaucrat on the residential schools file for 52 years, the man who refused to implement Dr. Bryce's reforms, is also buried there, along with Nicholas Flood Davin, the person who wrote the Davin Report that was requisitioned by John A. Macdonald and that led to the founding of industrial schools here in Canada. And so what we've done is we've actually created historical plaques that accurately tell the stories of these people. Not in ways with the Duncan Campbell Scott, for example. He was a Confederate poet. He was recognized as being a Confederate poet. But he's also recognized as being a key actor in what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission found to be cultural genocide. So on his historical plaque, it includes both passages, Confederate poet and cultural genocide. For Dr. Bryce, the full story of his career is told as well, and same with Nicholas Flood Davin. You know, I think that this is something that is very essential teaching in a time when people are talking about taking down monuments. I actually don't agree with taking down monuments. I agree with telling the full and proper truth. And I think this is something that I'd like to see the National Capital Commission embrace with a lot more vigor. Because, for example, just a couple of years ago, there was an exhibit on Laurier and Macdonald. And it talked about the building of the railway, the first Francophone prime minister. It said nothing about their respective roles in residential schools. John A. Macdonald, who is an enthusiastic endorser of them and hired Duncan Campbell Scott, and Laurier, who was prime minister at the time when Dr. Bryce's reforms hit the newspaper and he did not press for those to be implemented and those kids' lives to be saved. If we are to learn from the past, we have to accurately tell the history of the country. We have to train a generation of children to learn from our collective history and not just the good and shiny parts. And what we've done with that is we've actually collaborated with Project Heart, and we've taken all the historical research that we've done on those plaques and we've converted it into school curriculum so that children are learning about these historical figures all over Canada as part of their Truth and Reconciliation Commission work. And then in addition to that, we've developed free activities that all children and families can do to promote the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action that are peaceful, that are respectful, that are evidence-based, and that make a meaningful difference. So we not only want to address the contemporary injustices, we urge you to recommend in this committee that Canada immediately comply fully with the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal's orders. We recommend that you work with the National Capital Commission and hope that they would be inspired by our Reconciling History project to create historical plaques here in Ottawa that recognize the true telling of history. We'd ask you to endorse the Spirit Bear Plan to end the inequalities across all areas, and to, of course, to fund and support Indigenous languages with the same vigor and enthusiasm that you do for French and English in this country. It is, to me, a travesty that Indigenous languages are not recognized as the official languages of this country when the name of the country itself comes from a First Nations word. If we truly want to live up to being a village, as Canada actually means, it means that we need to respect and honor the peoples who are the original founders of this nation. So with that, I thank you.
Thank you very much.